Hi everyone, I'm going to be doing an analysis of a parent-teacher communication situation that I encountered during my second practicum. First, let's take a look at the situation. The two actors in this situation are Mrs. Carter, who is the parent, and she is illustrated on the left, and Mrs. Pierce, who is the teacher, and she is illustrated on the right. The following situation pertains to Mrs. Carter's son, Justin, who is currently in Mrs. Pierce's grade 4 class. Basically, what is happening is that Mrs. Pierce is constantly being inundated with messages from Mrs. Carter via the phone, email, and notes in Justin's agenda. And all of these messages are questions and inquiries related to Justin's academic performance. Although Mrs. Pierce appreciates Mrs. Carter's avid interest in her son's academic performance, Mrs. Pierce feels that Mrs. Carter is overstepping her boundary and, quite frankly, is becoming a bit of a nuisance. Next, let's take a look at some of the communication theories that relate to this situation. The first communication theory is expectancy violations theory. Essentially, this theory states that individuals have different expectations and perceptions of one another, and that any deviations from these expectations, whether it is a positive or a negative response, is referred to as a violation. In regards to the case in point, Mrs. Carter expects Mrs. Pierce to provide her with frequent updates and feedback about Justin's scholarly progress. On the other hand, although Mrs. Pierce acknowledges that Mrs. Carter needs to be aware of how her son is progressing in school, she also needs to respect her as a professional teacher and to support her professional decisions and opinions. Clearly, both women have two different expectations of how each of them should perform their role in relation to Justin's academic performance. Thus, their expectations of one another have been violated by one another. The second communication theory that pertains to this case study is uncertainty reduction theory. This theory states that uncertainty is uncomfortable and that people communicate to alleviate discomfort. With respect to this case study, the reason why Mrs. Carter is constantly inquiring about Justin's academic performance is because she is trying to discern whether or not Mrs. Pierce is competent at her job. That is, Mrs. Carter is just trying to alleviate some feelings of uncertainty that she has towards Mrs. Pierce as a teacher. Conversely, through her frequent unpleasant interactions with Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Pierce's feelings of discomfort towards Justin's mother are not being alleviated, but instead are increasing and being reinforced. Mrs. Pierce feels that Mrs. Carter is not giving her enough credit as a professional teacher and is overstepping her boundaries as a parent. The third and final communication theory that substantiates the following situation is symbolic interactionism. This theory states that having a sense of self means that humans are a distinctive type of actor in this world. Human beings can interact with themselves and analyze their own wants, needs, and thoughts. In essence, the possession of a self provides the human being with a mechanism of self-interaction, which can then be used to inform one's conduct and how one should act in this world. So I've included some I want, I need, and I think statements around Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Pierce. Mrs. Carter essentially feels that Mrs. Pierce is not as committed to Justin as she is, and Mrs. Carter acts the way she does towards Mrs. Pierce because she needs more of an effort from Mrs. Pierce to justify why she's the best possible grade 4 teacher for her son, Justin. On the other hand, Mrs. Pierce wants Mrs. Carter to support her professional judgments and opinions as a professional teacher, because they are made to support Justin's academic performance, not hinder it. Mrs. Pierce acts the way she does towards Mrs. Carter because she feels that their relationship is not productive and not conducive to putting Justin's needs first. Basically, Mrs. Pierce wants to form a productive relationship with Mrs. Carter where they're working together versus working against one another. A technological solution that would address some of the issues that arose in this case study is an e-portfolio and social networking site called Student Jotter. Let's take a closer look at how Student Jotter could help solve this parent-teacher communication problem. Student Jotter allows students to keep a portable digital repository of all of their schoolwork. Therefore, every piece of work that the child completes at school is accessible at the click of a mouse. Student Jotter even allows for safe storage of their documented personal learning, which can then be retained and transported to other learning platforms. By keeping a collection of a child's work online, it demonstrates their achievements, allows them to reflect upon their learning, and plan future learning goals. Moreover, because of its safe and secure social networking capabilities, it not only allows teachers to monitor what students are accessing online, but they can also review, assess, and provide constructive feedback about a student's piece of work. This is a fresh, personalized, and collaborative approach to assessment, which engages and motivates students. Teachers are also able to respond to questions provided by concerned parents via the social networking application. As for the parents, they can view their child's work anytime, anywhere, and be kept up to date about their child's academic performance, such as their strengths and areas needed for improvement. Additionally, parents can also communicate with the teacher to ask the teacher questions in relation to their child's progress or the feedback that they provided to their child. For instance, if Mrs. Carter had some questions pertaining to a particular assignment that Justin completed, or a question with respect to the feedback that Mrs. Pierce provided to Justin, all Mrs. Carter would have to do is email Mrs. Pierce her concerns using the Student Jotter social networking application. This method would allow Mrs. Carter to communicate with Mrs. Pierce in an efficient and effective manner without overstepping her boundary and ruining her relationship with Mrs. Pierce. In turn, Mrs. Pierce would respond to Mrs. Carter's email and address her questions promptly and in an appropriate manner through one communication outlet, compared to the numerous messages that she tried to respond to and keep track of originally from a variety of different communication sources, such as the phone and communication notes via Justin's agenda. Also, because Mrs. Carter was constantly bombarding Mrs. Pierce with inquiries pertaining to Justin and waiting for Mrs. Pierce to respond, she's now able to go online anywhere and at any time to view Justin's academic progress. By doing this, Mrs. Carter is better informed about Justin's strengths and areas needed for improvement. Thus, if Mrs. Carter needs to contact Mrs. Pierce at any time, her questions will be more focused and tailored to the work displayed on Justin's profile in Student Jotter, instead of asking an array of questions using different communication outlets. However, this is not to say that Justin's mom cannot communicate with Mrs. Pierce through the phone or through face-to-face communication, such as during parent-teacher interviews. It is just that Student Jotter provides a more controlled medium in which to converse directly about Justin's schoolwork, because it is easily and readily accessible online. Therefore, Student Jotter would be a possible solution to Mrs. Carter's and Mrs. Pierce's communication dilemma because it facilitates interactions and allows for collaborative communication. If Student Jotter is effectively implemented, it can serve as a digital platform to enhance teacher-parent communication. This would help to facilitate a more productive partnership and an amicable relationship between Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Pierce, because Justin's academic performance would be their #1 priority. That concludes my presentation. The following are my references. Thank you all very much for listening.